getting a few people coming in. Great, thank you for starting the recording. We'll just give it a couple more minutes before we get started. Come in, get a cup of coffee or tea or whatever you're having, depending on your time of day. Get started in a couple minutes. Looks like we have a couple more people coming in. Welcome to those of you who are joining us, as we are now at the 2 o'clock hour where I am in lovely Washington, D.C. I want to welcome you all to this panel. I'm Janet Edmond with Conservation International, and we have been working with IUCN and the Gender Office on this panel, which is almost closing out the Commission on the Status of Women 66, 2 weeks of exciting information. And I think you're going to be really pleased with how we put the frosting on the cake here. So again, I'm Janet Edmond with Conservation International, for those of you joining us. Our panel is going to be looking at strategies to improve gender responsive rights-based conservation and climate change. And I just want to put out there that we wrote the proposal for this really looking at gender in the most broad context, you know, recognizing that men and women have different roles in conservation. We also are using a more comprehensive social cohesion, social inclusion. So we're looking at all the other aspects that come into conservation, like race and age and ethnicity and these things. So I see we still have a couple more people coming in. So I just want to thank at the beginning, everyone, all the panelists and all the behind the scenes work that went into doing this. We really appreciate everyone's collective work. We're gonna have the panel discussion in just a minute, but I was gonna kick it off with some Mentimeter questions. Hopefully you all have your phone with you. Oh yeah, we could do housekeeping first, or we could do Menti, either one. Yeah, so I'll just thank you for that. The virtual, just to let you know that the session is being recorded. So by being present, you do agree to be recorded. We're asking for your consent with that. We're going to keep the microphones muted just to, you know, decrease the background noise. We do really want you to be active. So we're going to do a little Mentimeter poll at the beginning and the end. And please, you know, through the chat, please offer comments. And if you have any issues, just also use the chat, because we're actively monitoring that. So. Okay, I think we can kick it off to our Mentimeter. We have the code. It's right there. You can go to www.menti.com and put in this code 4092 4813. And you should get a question on your phone. So we'll just give it a couple minutes for people to get into the Menti. And hopefully you guys have used this before as a way to kind of get people thinking into the space of what we're talking about, the complex issues that we're talking about today. So here's our first question. Hopefully you have seen this on your phone. So what region of the world do you work in? And we recognize the time is great for the US and Latin America. Some of our colleagues in Asia, it's a bit early. So thank you for joining us. Okay. Give it a couple more minutes. For those of you who are coming in, we're doing an exercise on Menti menti.com. If you go there on your phone or your browser and you put in the code that you can see at the top. Okay, so we're definitely got the US and Canada looming, with some Europe and some Latin America. It's great. Oh, and Africa, excellent. Someone is very, very brave. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, I think we'll go on to the next question. So, you should be seeing this on your phone. It should pop up. So do you have experience working at the intersection between gender, governance, and climate change? Just don't think about it too much. Just figure out where you are between having zero experience and having a lot of experience. So, okay. Very interesting. So we're kind of in the middle. All right. Excellent. So it looks like we can maybe learn from each other in this, right? This panel will definitely give us a lot. Those of us who haven't had much experience, and then those of us who have been working on this. So it's excellent. Great. Okay. And for those of you coming in, we're doing a Mentimeter exercise. You can see at the top, menti.com and the code. Okay, here's our last question. So when you think of these issues, what are some strategies? What are some examples that come to mind when you think of strategies in this context? And again, don't think about it too much. Just put in there what you think, what comes to mind. Local engagement. Engagement, yeah. What are the things we really need to consider when we're working in this space? Cultural sensitivity, absolutely. Conflict analysis, participation. Great. Advocacy, I like that one. Gender bias. Yep. Female leadership. Empowerment. Integrated environmental planning. All right. Yeah, these are great. And definitely, seeing the advocacy, participation. It's a very mobile cloud we have there. This looks great. I think we're going to see a lot of these themes play out in the panel. So thank you very much, Alexandra, for doing that. And thank you all for participating. That was fantastic. I think we've got a good group here today assembled, and we're really looking forward to hearing from our panel. I'm going to introduce a very early day tomorrow, my time. so Khalid, thank you so much for leading us in this panel and introducing our speakers, and we really look forward to the Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Janet. So good morning, everyone. Maybe some of you find it weird why I'm saying good morning. So as you can see, I'm from Monash University in Australia. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. So I got up early today, obviously looking for an exciting discussion we are going to have with, I would say, 5 very powerful speakers with a lot of knowledge and with passion of working on rights-based, gender responsive conservation and climate change programming, which we are going to focus on today. And we're going to talk about different frameworks and different experiences our speakers, they already worked on, or they have experience on. So we have 5 speakers, and when they would talk, obviously you would see their detailed bio in the chat box. But just to tell you the order of today's session, this section at least. So we are having 5 speakers, 5 panelists. So Georgia Hartman, Jessica Campese, Alexis Manuela Canari, Cecilia Gutierrez, and Elizabeth Mcleod. And each of them would talk around 10 minutes. I would just give them a soft reminder at 9 minutes mark. And then they would finish within 10 minutes, and each of them would press present. So we would have around 50 minutes for their presentation. Then we would have around 20 minutes for Q&A. But I would request all of you who are joining today, put your question when as a panelist is giving a talk, so that we collect the questions during the session, and then we can moderate that during the Q&A section. So now let us move to Georgia Hartman. She's working as the Gender and Environment Technical Advisor at USAID. So Georgia, over to you, and welcoming everyone again.
Thank you, Khalid. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Laura, could you switch to the next slide? Go ahead and get it started. I am here today to talk to you about some research that USAID developed in partnership with IUCN through our Advancing Gender in the Environment mechanism agent to identify this, what we're calling the triple nexus. And it's a triple nexus between climate vulnerability, state fragility, and gender inequality. It is my hope that by the end of this presentation, you will understand why we did this research, the method we used to design the quantitative framework for measuring the triple nexus, and then hopefully some of our main findings, particularly those related to data and to women's leadership and empowerment. Next slide. All right, so why did we do this? Great question. So there is, of course, a lot of research looking at parts of the nexus. So looking at the relationship between climate vulnerability and state fragility on the one hand, and looking at state fragility and gender inequality. But there wasn't a lot of literature that one that we found when we undertook the formal research, or that we understood anecdotally, really looking at these three things together. So we were very interested to, well, one, answer, is this a nexus worth investigating? Does this exist? Is there existing literature on it? And then how can we, once we've identified it, create an empirical basis for this nexus, right? For justifying why we're doing this work, and then to measure it in different countries around the world. So, we wondered, how can we measure this? Great question. What might existing national data be able to tell us about this triple nexus, and what knowledge gaps need to be filled to be able to do this research, and then of course subsequently address it in programming. And finally, of course, how might our actual research design itself inform our learning? And I think anyone in this room who has undertaken the process of figuring out how to actually use quantitative measurements, use indicators, measure and evaluate anything, can, I think, empathize with how difficult it is to take this big question you have, this theoretical question, and really kind of like put it into motion. So we did it though, I think. So to answer these questions, we did a couple things. First, we conducted a literature review to help us A, understand if indeed there is this gap in the literature, B, what accepted international indicators we might use to define and measure it. And then, of course, based on these findings, we then used those indicators to construct a framework and method for measuring the triple nexus. So the next step, of course, was to do it, which this slide gets at. From the literature review, we were able to understand a few things. One, there is a gap. Great, awesome. Now we just have to fill it. Climate vulnerability and state fragility also do indeed have different impacts on men and women. This is an important finding. And then another important finding I'm going to continue to harp on as well is that women have valuable knowledge and distinct adaptive capacities that really we need to lean on in order to address not just gender inequality, right? But that empowering women is also key to addressing the other points in this nexus, is key to addressing climate vulnerability and also key to addressing state fragility. And so based on these findings, we designed the triple nexus framework to use 27 quantitative accepted country level indicators and evaluated the triple nexus in 122 developing countries. So next slide. So I'm just going to touch real quick on how we sort of define these. I would refer you to look at the report to get into more detail, so I'm not reading off a list of the indicators. But I want to emphasize basically that throughout this was a very long and messy process to finalize the selection of indicators. And that itself was a huge learning for us. Indeed, of course, in the end, the lack of data was one of the main findings that we had in this research, and in particular, a lack of gender indicators and just an overall lack of sex disaggregated data. Now, with regard to climate vulnerability, we defined climate vulnerability as the degree to which something or someone can be harmed by or cope with a climate stressor. So to systematize this, we used indicators linked to things like natural disasters, percent of the population affected by them, the percent of the population employed in agriculture, access to water, among other ones. Next slide. So then our state fragility indicators. So what is state fragility? We define this as the extent to which state and society relations fail to produce outcomes that are considered to be effective and legitimate. To measure this, we used indicators such as those relating to violent conflict, state use of political terror, child marriage, and voice and accountability. Next. And gender inequality indicators. So gender equality we took to be defined as a state in which all people have equal opportunity to benefit from and contribute to, or rather gender equality, and benefit from and contribute to economic, social, cultural, and political development. And so some of the indicators that we looked at to measure this, and again, this was one of the harder ones, were things like inheritance rights of widows and daughters, laws against gender-based violence, basic education, and political representation. So, next slide. So this is all what it looked like mapped. Once the indicators were designed and mapped by country, we're able to kind of overlay the data on top of each other and create a ranking from very high risk, low risk, moderate risk, very high, etc. And what we found was that countries that tended to rank high in one of the variables of vulnerability tended to rank high across all of them. And we found a statistically significant correlation between these issues. And of course, we were able to produce this map that also tells us something about the places that are at the highest risk in the nexus. Next slide. So what did we learn from this process? We learned, of course, policy frameworks must understand and integrate these linkages to better serve women in fragile contexts. So indeed, if we want to address climate vulnerability and state fragility, and of course, gender inequality as well, we have to take gender inequality into account if we want to be reaching women in those contexts. And there are a couple of things certainly that we are doing here at USAID and in partnership with IUCN to do this. One of the things that we are doing with IUCN is to work with partner countries to develop what we're calling gender and climate change action plans. So those are, we call them CC gaps. These CC gaps basically assist partner countries in integrating gender considerations into their climate plans and into their policy framework. Of course, as I've already alluded to several times, one of the major findings was that there isn't a lot of data out there about this. This was very difficult to design this study. And at the most basic level, it was very hard to find sex disaggregated data. And so, one of the, key findings, of course, is this lack of data. And we are also working, and certainly IUCN is working on trying to fill that gap in a very deliberate way. One of the things that is in the works is the formation of a Gender and Environment Data Alliance to address precisely these data gaps, because of course, coming up with these empirical evidence is really important to policy and programming. And then finally, that a cross-sector approach to research and programming is key. So very often, particularly in the gender and environment space, those are actually gender and environment spaces separate from one another. And really to successfully address any one of the points on these nexus, we really need to be cooperating across these sectors. There are a number of strategies for doing this, as listed here, right? Like, using gender indicators, ensuring they're integrated into environment programs, and vice versa. And of course, using a gender analysis as a tool in environment programming is very helpful. So next slide. All right, so that is about it. I want to thank IUCN, the IUCN team for this research, in particular, the lead authors of this study, Molly Gilligan, Selena Meyer, Emmett Boyer, along with Ruta Itis and Craig Betty, and of course, everybody else on the agent team. And yeah, I look forward to the rest of the presentation and y'all's questions. Cheers.
Thanks, Georgia, and thanks for be within the allocated time. And you have given some excellent perspective about how to see things from a triple nexus perspective. Like, it's very important in terms of designing interventions, and hopefully we would talk more during Q&A section. I would now request Jessica Campese to start her presentation. She's an independent consultant on natural resource governance and rights-based approaches, and you can already see her detailed bio in the chat box. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thanks. Good morning, evening, and night. Thanks so much to IUCN and CI for the opportunity to be here, and for all of you being here, the rest of the panel. I'm excited to learn from everybody today. I'm here today with as a member of CESP, the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, and I'm just going to share a little bit about the natural resource governance framework as a strategy for learning about and taking action to improve natural resource governance, including for more gender responsive and rights-based conservation. Next slide, please. So this term governance is used in a bunch of different ways. Within this work, some of the anchors for understanding it or defining it that we've found helpful are here on the slide, including looking at it through the structures, processes, norms that determine how power and responsibilities are formed and exercised, and I think more accessibly, just the question of how and by whom decisions are made and upheld in relationship to the environment, including how women and other rights holders have voice in the process, claim rights, and how duty bearers are held to account. Next, please. So why focus on governance? These questions of governance, of how and by whom decisions are made, how power relationships are formed, are really critical determinants of the equity and effectiveness and sustainability of the processes of conservation and of their social and environmental outcomes, including gender responsiveness, including whether and how rights are upheld. And there is so much growing attention to environmental governance, natural resource governance, and growing attention to the recognition and support for Indigenous peoples and local communities, rights and roles in governance systems. And at the same time, we know that there's still widespread rights violations, widespread instances of exclusion in conservation programming and practices that arise in part from inappropriate and unjust governance of conservation work, and of violations of rights and threats to environmental defenders, including many women. So there's urgent need to continue learning and improving natural resource governance. Next slide, please. And there are a bunch of strategies for doing that, a bunch of interconnected pathways for understanding and taking action to improve governance. Today, I'm focusing on one framework and one strategy for using participatory assessment as a way of learning about sort of the current strengths and challenges in governance of natural resources and conservation interventions, and finding ways to improve those. But that assessment-based learning, I think, is meaningful and matters in relationship to all the other ways of learning and taking action on governance and isolation. Assessment itself is not necessarily impactful. So assessment within a broader body of strategies can be very powerful. Next, please. The IUCN Natural Resource Governance Framework is a knowledge basket or a collection of resources and strategies for applying them through participatory measures. Collectively, these resources aim to offer a robust, inclusive, and credible approach for assessing and improving natural resource governance at multiple levels and across diverse contexts. And I'll share at the end the link. There's a link there, but I think you can't hyperlink from this. So at the end, there's also a URL where you can find our website and access these resources, and I'll share my contact information as well. Next, please. So at the heart of this knowledge basket, or the center of it, is a conceptual framework for understanding natural resource governance and building more equitable and effective approaches to it. It's been developed over the last 10 years or so with CESP and the IUCN Secretariat and many other partners across the Union. Underlying the framework are two values, one of which is social equity and human rights, and the other of which is sustaining nature. And then the framework sort of unpacks those values or weaves through 10 principles, those values. So these are 10 principles for effective and equitable natural resource governance, and then criteria for looking at the extent to which or the ways in which those principles are being upheld in different contexts. And the framework itself, the principles and the criteria, aim to form a basis for essentially structuring a series of questions or indicators that are developed to meet a particular context, but that form the basis of participatory assessments to reveal the specific, and hone in those specific challenges and opportunities for improving governance in a relationship to these principles. Next slide. So this and the next slide have the 10 main NRGF principles. I won't read them all. You can read them on the slides or access the resources. But one thing I wanted to just point out is that the social inclusion, gender equity, and the human rights elements are woven throughout the principles. And rather than there being sort of a specific principle on them. So for example, under the principle of recognition and respect for tenure rights, there's recognition and respect broadly for tenure rights, as well as particular attention to the customary and collective rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and specifically to women's tenure rights. Next slide. This is the other 5 principles. Again, you can read through those. And I think another thing in applying these principles and the framework in a lot of different contexts, one of the things that's also come out really clearly is both the importance individually of the principles for really thinking through and unpacking, like, what are the elements that really uphold and help us realize social inclusion and operationalize or implement rights-based approaches and right to respect in our conservation program. They matter individually for that, and also in relationship to each other, right? They're inseparable as well. So, you know, in one of the participatory assessment processes in Tanzania, one of the women who's participating was really, for example, drawing attention to the ways in which inclusive decision making is important for her, both in and of itself, and insofar as also because without voice, without participation, there is no accountability, right? If she, you know, it's much harder to hold district officials, other officials, to account for their decisions around upholding tenure laws and women's tenure laws if that participation and voice isn't there. And so we found the framework helpful in sort of distinguishing like some of the key elements around inclusive governance, as well as the relationships between them. Next slide, please. And so while those 10 principles aim to sort of unpack like some of the big elements of effective and equitable conservation, those are also really still, those 10 principles are really still big ideas in and of themselves, each one. So within the framework, there are also criteria that help identify like more discrete questions, more discrete aspects of each principle to consider in the process of assessing strengths and challenges in relationship to a particular governance system. And for each principle, there are criteria pertaining to law and policy, to processes and to practice, and that help also understand the relationships between those. So for example, for inclusive decision making, you know, is there a law or policy or rule or within in a governance system, you know, requiring access to participatory processes, to participatory planning, including women and men and all people. And then are there actually processes in place through which that law is being operationalized? Are there functioning mechanisms for that participation? And then beyond that, what are people's lived experiences of women and men? What, you know, is their voice heard in practices, and is that carried through to decisions? So these criteria, these sort of like further unpacking of the principles into these questions, that's really where the framework then provides a basis for developing like guiding questions or indicators that are much more context specific and that really help get into the details of how social inclusion and rights are or aren't being upheld through different governance systems. Next slide, please.
Jessica, you just have 1 minute left.
1 minute left. Okay, great. I'm almost done. So how have these things actually been used? The NRGF has been used for doing participatory assessments in a wide variety of contexts, including landscape governance assessments and assessments of particular conservation projects and programs to see how they are governed and how they include different rights holders and how they then address governance issues within the landscape where the conservation interventions are being done. And that question of, we put a lot of focus on how the assessment process itself is done. So to ensure that the process itself is human rights based and inclusive, right? So because that question then of not just like what questions we're asking about governance is important, but also whose answers are being heard, whose stories are being told through the assessment process, and who's having the opportunity to learn and hear from one another in the social learning that happens through the assessment. Next slide, which is the last one as well. And then in addition to the assessment, which is has been a really powerful, opportunity for social learning, the NRGF process also includes a strong focus on action planning and setting up a process for continued learning after the assessment. I think there's always a danger that assessment becomes just sort of a technical or box ticking exercise. And we really encourage rather that it be a starting point for developing relationships and a process to address the concerns that arise in inclusive ways. Next slide. So I apologize for sort of rushing through that. It's quite a lot, but that is my email address, and that's the website for the NRGF materials, and I'd be very happy to follow up with more. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it's a big framework. It's really difficult to finish it in 10 minutes, but obviously we would have more discussion around that during Q&A section. I would now move to the next speaker, Alexis Manuela Canari. Alexis, over to you.
Thank you so much. Could you hear me correctly? Great.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Greetings from Germany. Well, thank you all of you for being here, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. Today, I would like to share with you some reflections from the IUCN Global Youth Summit, which took place in April last year. This was an exceptional, open, and participatory process where young people from around the world shared ideas, demands, commitments, as well as challenges as young people working in the conservation field and in the protection of the environment. We had the opportunity to get to know firsthand experiences from young people coming from different backgrounds, young people in the front lines, as well as people from indigenous communities and rural areas. They did not only present demands, but also shared how they are working in their own communities, upholding rights and ensuring equitable and effective governance for all. I would like to emphasize that the Youth Speak outcomes were created by youth at the summit. However, they do not speak for all youth. Even if the event was carried out fully virtually, giving the opportunity to more young people to join us, we are aware that we missed many voices due to digital and language barriers, to name just a few. The Youth Speak dialogues highlighted two main points that I would like to share with you. First, the strong commitment of young leaders to reframe development with environmental ethics and race-based approaches as core values for positive peace. Youth is aware that restoring harmonious human and nature relationship is critical to creating resilient societies, particularly nowadays when communities are already facing emerging security risks connected to climate change, food insecurity, and weather shortages, along with other threats that do not recognize political borders anymore. Second, it was emphasized the urgent need to recognize and support youth-led peace-building grassroots organizations focusing on the protection of nature. I decided to bring the youth perspective today because we span a great range of ages, nationalities, ethnicities, genders, sectors, worldviews, and more. We call upon the conservation and environmental community to have present these overlapping interconnected identities. The number of young people aged between 15 and 24 years is currently 1 billion, or 16% of people. And I'm not here mentioning the people that the general number under 35 years old. Then I mentioned that because young people will be strongly affected by, for example, climate change. and we need to be included in processes of decision making. Youth perspective can contribute to better shape strategies to improve peace and sustainability, since young people are already developing projects that have environmental ethics, ecocentrism, gender responsive, and rights-based and sustainability at their core. Furthermore, taking into account these reflections are key to fostering the next generation of leaders to drive the adaptation agenda and its implementation worldwide. Youth also are assuring the continuity of traditional knowledge. That also means intergenerational equity, as well as intergenerational renewal, for example, in the management of land. The empowerment of youth must be accompanied by respect for intergenerational traditions. And last but not least, young people are eager to learn and replicate projects in their own communities, but also to be involved and participate in decision-making processes at local, national, and international level. Having said that, now I would like to share with you some particular concerns that youth raised during the summit that need to be tackled when we want to develop strategies that include gender responsive and right-based approaches. Due to time limitations, I will only share 4 main points, but I can share with you the complete document after. Please, next slide. Thank you. The first point is acceptance of the rights of others. We were really concerned about to emphasize the importance to the rights of nature, recognize that human and non-human beings equally deserve rights and freedom. As mentioned by a member of the Arhuacos community from Colombia during the summit, during one of the sessions, Amado Villafana mentioned that the rights of nature is critical for us, and we totally agree with that. Also, we are concerned about the rights of indigenous communities and ethnic minorities, which until now are fighting to properly have their land rights, the right to natural resources, and right to self-determination, consultation, participation, and special representation. These frameworks need to be more forceful and compelling. The next point is connected to equitable distribution of resources and opportunities. And here I would like to emphasize our concern about the need to reinforce regulations of destructive and industrial sectors that lead to ecological abuses and a lack of equitable benefit sharing with local communities. Unfortunately, many countries suffer from what is known as the resource curse. That has greatly affected the management of natural resources, affecting economic activities from which communities depend on. Also connected to that, smallholder farmers play a crucial role in food security, but agricultural poverty arises, as well as the lack of intergenerational renewal. It is necessary to recognize that the role of young women and men by developing programs that provide them tools for better managing natural resources. While providing these tools, it is important to keep in mind and tackle the existing structural inequality. Not only are women hindered from having land titles or rights and access to it, but also they face disadvantages such as unpaid work, insecure employment, and exclusion from decision-making and political representation. Gender-based violence in all its forms increases and is exacerbated by climate change. It is important to mention, for example, that it has been an increasing rate of child marriage during prolonged times of drought, and it is used by families as a strategy to cope with the scarcity of food and income. Finally, I would like to mention also that young women and young people, youth people in general, are considered most of the time not legitimate landowners and suffer from generational prejudice because of their limited work experience and also due to gender norms and beliefs. The third point that I would like to raise is the necessity of access to information and protection. When I talk about that, it's related to meaningful youth engagement. This process requires young people to be involved in all levels and stages of programs, policy, campaign, and initiative development, including all stages of design, implementation, and evaluation. This is especially true of those programs that directly affect their lives. I would like also here to emphasize the importance to work or to strong frameworks for protecting land and environmental defenders. As mentioned by the General Coordinator of the Indigenous Organization of the Amazon, COICA, Jose Gregorio Diaz, he strongly emphasized the importance to protect, defend environmental leaders, but giving them mechanisms of protections. He mentioned it actually that many environmental defenders were unjustly punished and put in prisons. These cases need to be published and shall have the possibility of advice, defense, and representation. One more point that
Alexis, you just have 1 minute left. Okay. Sorry for that.
Yeah, no worries. I will try to summarize. One more point that I would like to share is that that it was mentioned that also the importance to have into account the situation of women, environmental and land defenders who are suffering from different kinds of violence, including sexual violence. To finalize, the last point is inclusive education. And I would like to emphasize that by saying that it was strongly mentioned that digital and linguistic barriers need to be tackled in order to increase reciprocal learning. Protecting languages means protecting knowledge. English is not the language of conservation. We need to create more dialogue spaces in different languages to hear from different perspectives and to revalue traditional knowledge. As well as we cannot rely only on the communities at the front lines, but also we need to change the mainstream education by incorporating environmental and ecological citizenship. The very last point that I would like to raise is that we need to connect more disciplines. I think that when we are talking about conservation and environmental communities, we need to talk more with the, for example, peace building community, and also to have more projects that tackle conflict sensitivity. As, for example, when we are talking about clean water or access to land, we need to understand also that it means what it means in terms of safety, security of people, as well as the avoidance of conflict. There is still a lot of work to do on this topic. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Alexis. Thanks for bringing youth voice in the table. I guess there will be a number of questions around that. Our next speaker is Cecilia Gutierrez. She's working for Conservation International in Peru, bringing some of her experience from the ground. Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me and to share Conservation International experience regarding the implementation of a gender-based violence project within conservation. Next, please. So our project name was Conservation of the Alto Mayo Landscape Without Gender-Based Violence. We implement this project with our partner PROMSEX. PROMSEX bring all the technical capacity regarding gender-based violence, and Conservation International have the closeness to the community we work with, that is the Champuyacu community that is located in the northern Amazon of Peru. We have been working in this community for more than 8 years now, especially with this group of women, the ones that you can see in the picture. They are called NUWAs, NEXUS means in our home language, women. So we bring to this project our closeness with these groups of women, and also our knowledge of the community, the customs of the community, their traditions. And this project was financed by USAID in the framework of the RISE Challenge initiative. Next, please. The USAID RISE Challenge, RISE meaning Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable Environments, is an initiative that seeks to understand the links between GBV, gender-based violence, and natural resources management. This looks for evidence within these interventions. We have, for this cohort of the RISE Challenge, we implement projects in Guatemala, Kenya, Vietnam, and Peru, the one that I'm speaking today. And it seeks to have evidence from these interventions in order to have effective policies for GBP. We implement this project last year. We started last year in 2021, and we are finishing the project next month, in a couple of months. Next, please. We initiate the project during the second wave of COVID, so it was challenging. Our work in this indigenous community in Champuyacu, as I mentioned, started in 2013. We have been working with them different sustainable economic activities, and some of them are specially targeted for women and are linked with their cultural traditions, such as the production of medicinal plants, manioc, and they have an ecotourism initiative also regarding one piece of land that women manage that is called the NEXUS Forest. And they also have an herbal tea that is based on their medicinal plants that is called the NEXUS tea. We work with this community under a conservation agreement that is a tool that uses Conservation International in order to give communities some benefits in exchange of the conservation of their ecosystems. Next, please. Why we apply to the RISE Challenge? We apply for several reasons, because our efforts to increase women's independence and the incomes from these sustainable activities increase the risk of suffering from GBV. We are changing with these sustainable activities the roles that traditionally women have in this community. So this puts them at higher risk. Also, because in our home communities, there is a high tolerance to gender-based violence, a really high normalization of violence. Physical violence is seen as a way of solving conflicts between partners, and it's very normal because we have a very close relationship with these women from that community. They mention in several times that they suffer from sexual, physical, psychological violence. Other things that happen is that they have less access to resources, especially economic resources, opportunities, and services. And because this was a great opportunity to address gender-based violence with a specialized partner and to learn for all of us at Conservation International. Even we have this close relationship with that community, we didn't have like the tools, or we didn't know how to address this very sensitive issue with this group of women and with that community. Next, please. How we did it? we first initiated the project with a social tolerance study regarding gender-based violence. We had several interviews with people from the community in order to understand how much they tolerate gender-based violence, and also to see what are the main causes behind this normalization and toleration of gender-based violence. So based on that, we can design all our training sessions and capacity building for the community. We did gender-based violence awareness workshop for our staff and also for our partners that work in the field, training sessions about gender-based violence for women and men from the community, workshops with men about positive masculinity, training with women about sexual and reproductive rights. And another important piece was to involve local and regional authorities in order so they can understand the context of gender-based violence in indigenous communities, because most of the time local authorities make their strategies to address gender-based violence based on like urban spaces and not necessarily thinking about an indigenous community. Next, please. So I want to share here some of our greatest successes for the project. First, it was incredible to see all the commitment and participation of the NEXUS, of the women from the community. They really commit to all the training sessions and participate very actively. It was an issue that was very important to them. So that is why they really commit to all the trainings. Also, after all the session, November last year, it was an initiative that came up because of them. They create a woman community patrol that was led by them, by the women from the community. And they, in order to address gender-based violence, also for us, the acknowledgement of the importance of including gender-based violence in conservation projects. For us, as Conservation International Peru, we have now a new dedicated position that is focusing on leading gender-based violence and also gender within our staff. We involve people from other projects to participate in this session for men and women to increase their interest in, and also change some protocols from local authorities that oversees gender-based violence to adapt to an indigenous context. Next, please. Some challenges.
We just have one minute left.
Thanks. Some challenges that we found, as I mentioned, COVID was an important challenge we faced, especially to build trust for our partner, PROMSEX, because they didn't know the reality from the community or the context. And that was, we overcame at some point that situation, but it was complicated at some point also. It was our partner's first time working with the indigenous communities. Also, I think some of the, probably the most challenging thing would be to engage men and have their commitment and participation. At some point, there was an attempt to fragment the community patrol that was led by women, but by some group of men. And also we have to change some methodologies during the way of the project. Next, please. And to finalize, some lessons that we learned from the project is that it is very important to have a dedicated strategy to engage men. Also, that there is very important to have the necessary funds to address gender-based violence in conservation projects since the design in order to reach sustainability. The need also to educate authorities about the indigenous realities. What happened in indigenous context is not the same that happens in urban areas. And also the importance of having an experienced partner to implement these kinds of projects. So that would be it. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you, Cecilia. Wonderful picture. We used the pictures from Peru as the poster of our session. Very colorful. So we are now going to listen from our last speaker, Elizabeth Mcleod. And I request all of you to post your question again so that we can have an interactive conversation during Q&A section. Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all, IUCN and CI, for hosting today. I'm really happy to speak to you about some of our work at the Nature Conservancy in elevating women's leadership in responding to climate change impacts in the Pacific. Next slide, please. I think in the Pacific Islands and small island developing states more broadly, we know that they are truly on the front lines of climate change. And often they're characterized by fragility, high vulnerability to climate impacts, and lack of options to adapt. And unfortunately, these perspectives deny islanders the agency to define climate change on their own terms, to apply their own systems of knowledge, and to implement climate solutions that are locally relevant. Women, and particularly Pacific Island women, have consistently been left out of the climate literature and discourse. And when we exclude their input, the climate projects that are developed are less robust, less equitable, and they often miss really significant contributions of women, whether it's their valuable knowledge adapting to change over time, or specific knowledge gained from certain practices or jobs, such as certain types of fishing, processing of resources, or selling of natural resources. Next slide, please. When I started working with island communities and climate change 2 decades ago, I thought I had a really robust understanding of climate impacts. Things like sea level rise leading to coastal flooding and erosion. Next, please. Increasing storms that wreak havoc on coastal ecosystems and coastal communities, including significant flooding, which can wash away coastal vegetation, homes, and even grave sites in some places. Next, please. Changing rainfall patterns that lead to significant droughts or flooding. Next. And salt water coming into groundwater and gardens, which causes some wells to be unusable and also plants to die from salt water in the soil. But several years ago, I led a women's exchange, bringing together women from across the Pacific, from the Marshall Islands to Palau, across the Federated States of Micronesia and Papua New Guinea, to talk about climate change impacts and how they're leading climate action. And I realized that I had some really significant blind spots, both as a climate scientist and as a conservationist. Next, please. At this workshop, I heard for the first time how women and girls can be impacted differently by climate change. Many of the ideas that we've been talking about so far today on the panels. Women shared how their workloads were increasing significantly, but also I heard about increasing violence against women. A woman from the Marshall Islands shared that during drought, when they don't have enough water and the women aren't able to cook food or do the laundry, they can end up experiencing domestic violence from their partner. She also mentioned that during droughts, the schools have to close because they don't have water to prepare food or to flush the toilet, so the children miss out on valuable education. A woman from the island of Chuuk in the Federated States of Micronesia shared that often young girls have to walk farther during drought to get water from wells, and they can become victims of assault. So I started doing research on how climate change affects women and girls, and I learned about these patterns of violence following disaster. One example of 2 back-to-back tropical storms on a Pacific island resulted in an increase, 300% increase in new domestic violence cases that were reported. The same thing happened after Hurricane Katrina in the US, after Hurricane Harvey, and the same thing has happened during the COVID pandemic around the world when women are trapped in abusive settings and unable to access the support services that they often so desperately need. I also heard about how land ownership can affect women's ability to adapt. In communities where women may not be entitled to land rights due to customary laws and practices, where they have limited options for planting food to feed their families, this is becoming more of a problem as climate change is reducing the available land. One woman from Papua New Guinea shared that her grandfather came from another province, and she said that the landowners will not allow us to make gardens on the land or to fish from the sea. And with climate change, with coastal erosion, we want to and need to move inland, but we're not allowed to. The government has given us a piece of land, but we use the same soil again and again, and it's no longer fertile. So all of these examples demonstrate how people, and especially women, can really experience climate change in very different ways. But I also learned about how women are rising up to lead their communities in climate action, and I wanted to share some of those examples with you all today. Next slide, please. I heard about how women in the Pacific are leading climate solutions, like developing nurseries of native plants to help repopulate areas that have been damaged by flooding, how they're replanting coastal vegetation to protect their coastlines from sea level rise and storms. They're planting salt-tolerant varieties of taro, a traditionally important food crop across the Pacific, and sometimes moving taro patches to areas less vulnerable to climate change, or planting raised beds so that the plants aren't exposed to salt water in the soil. Another example from Papua New Guinea was where a women's group was trained in using traditional farming methods to improve soil fertility and using new crops that were more resilient to climate change. And through this training of this women's group, they now 90% of the families in this village have 3 meals a day, and a third of the families are selling surplus to local markets. Just showing the incredible impact that these kinds of projects can have on their communities. Next slide, please. I also met incredible women leaders like Bernadette Kadongan, who's here from the island of Yap in Micronesia. Bernadette attended a training that the Nature Conservancy led, where women came together to talk about how they were coping with climate change. And she learned methods for improving soil and new technologies for drought-tolerant and salt-tolerant crops. And she returned home and she was asked to present what she had learned to her traditional leaders. She shared about her experiences and her idea, which was to develop this community garden, which you see in the picture here, building on all of the things that she learned. So with support from the Nature Conservancy and local chiefs, she was given a grant to design and develop her community garden, which provided food and, most critically, a source of income for the women in her village. But it also helped to enhance the status of women in her community. Bernadette then was able to secure a grant from the government to support a raising awareness program of this garden among villages in Yap. And her project is now being scaled across the island to neighboring communities. So again, just showing the power of these locally led, locally driven climate projects. Next slide, please. I also learned about some really innovative projects where women's groups were leading the combination of traditional knowledge and GIS mapping. This is an example from the Marshall Islands that was led by a women's group called WUTMI, or Women United Together Marshall Islands, where they were geotagging local fruit trees that had been damaged by climate change impacts, showing where the trees were surviving and where they had died, so that they would know which areas of the island they should be planting new trees in, so that they would be more resilient to climate change impacts. So just a really great example of bringing together traditional knowledge and GIS mapping. Next, please. I also came to really appreciate the power of bringing women together in learning exchanges to share their experiences, their perspectives, and their leadership in climate action. These women's exchanges really provide an important forum to discuss ideas facing women, but they also allow women to speak freely in an all-female setting outside of their own cultural constraints. One of the women shared that in her own community, she might not be able to share her voice because she might have to defer to elders or to the men to speak. And the women consistently shared how critical it was to support these women's groups and to provide training on both business development and financial planning, in addition to helping them to access additional climate funding to support their local projects. They reinforced the importance of traditional knowledge and leadership, of policies that support women's adaptation efforts, including those that address violence against women and girls, that address the inequities of land ownership, and that the need to consider family planning in climate projects, especially where you have increasing populations that are increasing demand on resources. One key insight I wanted to share that was from one of the women who was there was talking about what happens when we use Western metrics of empowerment. And she said there's a lot of Western imposition in the international space, and you can devalue the roles that women have played in their cultural settings when they did have power. And we want to see policies revived or written that recognize traditional women's leadership roles. She said, the minute you say 4 women have to occupy seats of Congress, you're saying that their traditional leadership roles are no longer valued. So I just wanted to share that because I think it's a really important framing for thinking about when we're talking about metrics for women's empowerment, for women's leadership, that we need to be considering much broader systems than just the Western framing. Next slide, please. I also wanted to share.
You just have 1 minute left.
Thank you. I also wanted to share one really inspirational woman and how her work is leading to supporting the next generation of leaders. This is Marilyn Gaudet, and she's leading a project in her community to protect one of the largest sea turtle populations in the world in the Solomon Islands. Marilyn founded a local women's group called Kawaki, which unites 3 villages in the Arnavan Islands in the Solomons to protect their environment, their community, and their culture with support from TNC. So she's working to train local women to tag and track sea turtles. And she started one of the first women-led ecotourism ventures in the country, which is providing both women and girls with training in both conservation and business development. It is so important to amplify and elevate voices and leaders like Marilyn in conservation solutions on the global stage. We helped to shine a light on Marilyn, and she recently received an award from the Queen of England for her leadership in community conservation. So I just wanted to end with a next slide, please, a very powerful statement from a friend and traditional leader from Palau, Julie Talay. I think it is such a beautiful reminder that we all have the power and responsibility to make change in our own communities. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Lizzie. And each of the presentation deserve, a complete session, but we could not do justice to the presentation. But thanks again to all our presenters. I can't see questions coming in the chat box, but those who are present here, you can obviously raise your hand and unmute yourself. So while you do that, I would just kind of reflect on the presentations quickly. Like, we have heard about a couple of frameworks which USAID and IUCN are currently working on. Then we have heard a voice from the youth. So then we have heard a couple of examples from the ground, one from Peru, from Conservation International, another one from the Pacific, from the Nature Conservancy. And I can relate all of them with my work experience in the past, mostly like as I worked in Bangladesh. So we saw how these things, like which Georgia initially indicated, how these things play together, how climate vulnerability increases gender inequality, or if we have a gender unequal society, how we are also becoming more vulnerable. And then even if you talk about progress in terms of economic development, while you have that climate vulnerability or gender inequality, state still remains fragile. So since we are waiting for some questions, I would ask all of our presenters, like, okay, you have already presented a few things, you were closely engaged with these works, but while doing the work in the ground or being engaged in developing these frameworks, did you have, like, in the course of your work, any moment when what led you to change your course of thinking? Like, okay, you started doing something maybe in the ground, or even developing something, then you thought that, yeah, we can do it differently, and maybe that's also a learning for you. So an open question to all of you, maybe starting with Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak less specifically to my work and just more specifically to the Triple Nexus report that I presented about. I think the findings of the Triple Nexus are a prime example, particularly the finding about data, right? Like, in the course of doing this thing, to try to find an empirical framework that we could use to measure, gender inequality, state fragility, and climate vulnerability, we discovered, oh my gosh, like we don't have this data. This is a way bigger systemic problem than what we thought we were even taking on. And so, you know, it has created this whole additional work stream of addressing that kind of like meta layer issue.
Yeah, same experience. Like we, when I was working for IUCN, like we had an assessment, national assessment for, we did that with UN Women on climate change and gender equality policies, strategy in Bangladesh. And one of the main challenges was gender segregated data. Like even if you kind of try to analyze things and try to recommend something, but you don't have that gender segregated data. Even the areas you mentioned, we don't have, differentiated data there. It's always a challenge in different countries. Jessica, your reflection?
Okay. Well, I'm still learning and having aha moments all the time, every day. But I think one in relationship to what I was sharing today and what I heard from some of the other panelists too. I think there's a lot of interest, a lot of drive right now, including discussions in the ongoing negotiations in Geneva around the next Convention on Biological Diversity set of targets. We want to understand and be able to measure and sort of analyze and get our arms and heads around the social inclusion and governance and rights elements of conservation, I think, for good reasons. And these are not they're not simple or even sometimes possible things to measure in the same way that as conservation scientists and a conservation community, I think we are comfortable and want to be able to. And I think one of the things that was really striking for me about the work with CISP and IUCN and the governance framework is just the power of the process itself, which I was skeptical about going into it, honestly. And how many times do we sit around for a day or 2 days in a shared space and have open conversations about the specifics of our experiences with accountability, with rights and visibility and the experience of voice. And I think there's one thing that's been sort of surprising and powerful is the empowerment and the social learning and the excitement and positivity and hopefulness that comes out just of that inclusive dialogue process, right? And all of these frameworks, including the one I presented, I think provide like a potential structure to have that conversation around. But the power of the process, I think, really comes through the discussions that it can help create.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like as you were talking about different criteria of that framework, like those also work with one another. Like sometimes when you talk about accountability and you can't make the system accountable, then the whole participation, it becomes difficult. So sometimes this framework, people just say that, yeah, these are just frameworks. But then obviously we need to gather energy from practical experiences, I would say, like as Lizzie was indicating, or Cecilia was indicating. So things also happen there. Maybe the framework is somewhere there, but then we also have great experiences. And Alexis, what are the aha moments when you engage with the young people, but then you also see things differently?
Yeah, well, actually, I think I will amplify one key idea from the Youth Summit is like, we realize how important is multidisciplinarity in conservation. and many of us that already studied many other careers, for example, discover that how we can contribute to conservation and protection of the environment, for example. And I think, therefore, it is really important to establish these kinds of spaces, that's the Global Youth Summit and others, to gather young people, to give them this space to discover and also to exchange ideas and to know that there are spaces where they can contribute, even if they come from other backgrounds. And yeah, that was really, really good. I studied international relations and politics, but still I found like IUCN gave a space for that, and we are really like thankful for that, because we can contribute with our knowledge, even if we are from different part of the world and from different backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you also brought some interesting point, like since I work a lot with young people in the ground, especially the environmental defender, they always raise that and they value the platform because they say that we are already vulnerable due to different issues than working on environmental issues. Those are making us more vulnerable. So where is the platform? Like, and having this platform facilitated by others, where obviously young people taking the leadership, that's really important. And this needs to be kind of a long-term engagement, long-term commitment from conservation organization. I would say, like having that sort of support for environmental defenders. So thanks, Alexis, for bringing young people's voice. Cecilia, what about you? You already talked about some inspiring stories, obviously.
Yeah, I think that at some point of the project, or at the beginning of the project, we thought about like doing this training of trainers methodology. So we train a small group of women so they can share the knowledge with to reach more women in the community. And I learned from that when we asked them how they were going, they haven't been able to do any of the replica to the other women. And then we understand that in order to think about a strategy to address gender-based violence, you also have to ask the ones that are gonna implement it, or the ones that are gonna be affected by it. Because we learned that, for example, women didn't feel comfortable at all by being like learning and then have to do it to another group. You have to take into consideration other things, such as they didn't have enough self-confidence to do that. They also have a lot of work, a lot of household things to do and responsibilities. So they didn't have the time to do this replica. So we learned that you need to take into consideration a lot of things in order to develop a strategy when you address gender or gender-based violence, and most of all ask them, how do you feel with this? And we changed completely the strategy, and we did it in another different way. But yeah, that is one of, I think, our main learnings from that.
Yeah, and along with that, I also really was excited when we were talking about changes within the organization. How Conservation International kind of created a position regarding like a gender lead, focal person for gender-based violence. So a project kind of influenced the organization. I think that's also important for conservation organizations. Often, like we see, like gender equality is not a priority. I can talk from Global South, obviously. We have conservationists and don't see that link between conservation and gender. Is still the thing that many people think that that's a high-level discussion. They don't see the link in the ground, but you are changing, the organization is changing. There's a strong message for other organizations. Lizzie, last point from you.
I want to riff on that a little bit, actually, because I think that was such a great point. You know, I think certainly this work is really changing our conservation community more broadly. So individually, our organization, certainly at the Nature Conservancy, CI, and others, but really the community of how we think about conservation. I think for me, a key learning was also, and I alluded to this a little bit, but just being cognizant of our own framings that we bring to this. And I think as a Western woman with kind of Western ideas about what equality means, it's really very different. I mean, this is so obvious to say this, but I think, you know, just understanding our own biases that we bring to these conversations. You know, I have my favorite story when I started this work in, it was in a meeting in Palau, and a woman had given me these exercises. She was a gender expert from the UK, and it was to, you know, essentially you're asking to write characteristics of a woman and characteristics of a man on this whiteboard. And my friend from YAC came up to me and she was like, Lizzie, no, this is so awkward. We would never do this. Like, we need the men here. Like, it's so weird that we don't have, you know, this just doesn't work. And so it was, and I thought, you know, okay. And then another friend shared that in Pohnpei, there's an expression that's, you know, the men are the head, the woman is the neck that turns the head, but you need both. And so I think this elevates that idea that was raised earlier about the importance of engaging men in these conversations, engaging men in the solutions, and because if we're really changing practices and cultures and approaches, it's a system change that includes everybody. So, you know, I still have a lot to learn in that space. I share what others have said, that I think, you know, we're all learning as we go. But I really think just being aware of our own framings of what equality means and knowing that that's very, very different in different contexts, and we need to be respectful and mindful of that in our work. But thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. I think we always say, like, yeah, we understand, we talk about ecosystem a lot, but do we really understand social ecosystem when we try to work on ecosystem conservation? So I think that's really important for all of us. So thanks again to all the speakers. I would close the panelists discussion session here, and we have some, you know, few things left from Janet, Mentimeter and other things. Janet, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Khalid, and to all the panelists. This was fantastic. We did want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a question. I think maybe there was one person who had come on camera. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Is that Barbara? If you can unmute yourself, if you're allowed. Or you could type it in the chat, either way. We've had such great participation. We just have one closing thing before we end. Barbara, did you want to ask a question? Thumbs up or no? No? Okay. All right. Okay, great. Well, I think this has just been such a great view of all these different aspects that you guys have shown us, really looking at, you know, how can we take the theoretical into practice? We wanted to do another Menti exercise just to, you know, as we close the Commission on the Status of Women, what are some of these ideas we're going to take forward in our lives? So we have another Menti that we wanted to do. The code is different. So if you can go into your phone and type the 5905-8193 and the menti.com. We'd love to hear like how you've been inspired by these really awesome presentations that have given us the challenges, but then also given us ideas for how we can empower. And oh, look, we've got a higher thing on the learning. That's good. We moved it. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong question. Okay, so have you learned today? Has this helped to improve your learning? It looks like we went from a, what were we, 2.6? Now we're on a 4.4. So that's great. Definitely add in your ideas, whether you think this panel has really helped inform and spur you to maybe think about things differently. It's fantastic. Thanks for everyone who's participated. And then my question, which I just said, which is on the next slide. Sorry. So give us some ideas of what you're actually thinking you might do. What do you think? We've got some great examples that were just given to us. So what do you think you're going to do as you go forward after this 2 weeks of learning about women's empowerment, leadership, governance, climate change? What can we do? Great. Excellent ideas. Take real action. That's right. Absolutely. Definitely in terms of the social inclusion, definitely the listening, the empathy, keep acting, keep learning. Share, definitely. I think from all these presentations, we've definitely taken a lot of lessons and a lot of ways that we can apply them in our own work, right? Check assumptions, that's really good. Definitely. Leaving our biases behind. Yep. Great. So really good. We'll have to take a picture in our mind of all these and make sure that we bring them with us in our work, right? Reflect on them over the weekend and systems change, spread the word. Great. Thank you guys very much for participating, and we're at time. I want to give like a virtual round of applause to our panelists and Khalid, who set us up very nicely and managed our time, and we are just at the hour. So thank you again to Laura also and Alexandra, who really helped pull this panel together and make everything happen. So I want to thank you guys all very much, and thank you for joining us so much. So have a great, great weekend, and hopefully we will see you all soon.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Khalid,
Bye, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Khalid, I hope your day goes as well as this panel went. I think we lost him.
So great.
I'm gonna stop recording, Laura.
I will stop recording.